Professor Crowley said that you guys read that not no excuses, I'm sorry, that the broken windows approach had some minor reductions.
We looked at some experimental evidence of social
Right.
science testing of it that supported the theory, but we talked a little bit about the disproportionate impact of those policies on minority communities, which led us to the policing policy to fall out of favor.
So in terms of suspensions and expulsions, there's actually no data that indicates that it works. It depends on what you mean by work. If your objective is to get control in the classroom, then kicking out the kids who are disruptive, I guess that works, right? If your objective is to educate all the students, then it doesn't work. I mean, it works depending on what your goals are. Why do you think schools are doing it? What do you think the rationale is that they give, and they're still giving, for suspensions and expulsions? What do you think they think happens, besides just taking the misbehaving student out of the room?
To set an example, and also to use the minority to uphold the safety and the majority, how they act in class.
Absolutely. So you're setting an example. So the thinking is, if we show what happens if you misbehave, nobody else will do that, right? You'll learn by seeing how badly it went for that person. And they also are probably thinking, well, if we suspend you, you'll realize you're doing something bad, and when you come back, you won't misbehave anymore, right? The other reason that they do this is they think that it's a way of engaging parents, that if you suspend a child, the parent will say, oh, this is really serious, so we have to do something about it. Do you think that's what happens?
No.
You kind of got the sense that I wasn't going to go there, right? No, it's not. So misconception number one is that detention, suspensions, expulsions change student behavior. Absolutely no data for that. They do not improve student behavior. In fact, if you've been suspended or had detention or expelled, you have a much higher chance of having it happen to you again. 6% of students approximately receive a suspension in a year. 50% of them will get another suspension that same year. And at least 70% will experience at some point an additional suspension, right? So misconception number two, as you pointed out, is that it'll deter other students. It doesn't. Why doesn't it? Because the students who are not likely to act up, often students act up for very understandable reasons. They might be traumatized, they might be dealing with all sorts of issues at home, they might be hungry, they might be homeless. There's a million reasons why a child might be misbehaving, right? So the students who are not experiencing that, they're not gonna act up anyway. You don't have to demonstrate to them that this is what happens to you if you act up. But those who are, this doesn't deter them. They don't have the skills to engage in a more kind of constructive way. And then this idea about engaging parents, suspensions are not an effective way to engage parents. You have to actually build relationships with those families. So what are alternatives? Have you guys heard of alternatives to punitive approaches? Does anyone have, is their school, are any of your schools using alternatives? Look like a lot of suspensions when I asked. Is anyone doing anything but suspending? Wow, that's really distressing. New Jersey has a lot of work to do. Yeah.
Well, at my school, depending on what you did wrong, you could do volunteer work instead of doing detention.
How did they determine that? What was the process for?
I don't know. I just know, but it wasn't for you couldn't do it if you got written up for misbehaving or being rude to a teacher. But if you were on your phone or if you were late, then you could do that.
Wow, so being on your phone or being late got you in trouble?
If you were late 3 times at my school, you had detention every time for the next time you had it.
Wow.
Yeah.
My daughter would be in serious trouble.
I wasn't serious.
Yeah. So if you were rude to a teacher, that's interesting. Who
Yeah.
decides what's rude? The teacher.
The teacher can write you up and then you get sent to the VPO, which is the vice principal's office,
Right.
and then.
So I wonder if some students maybe are perceived as more rude than others, even if they're not. Yeah.
So I went to a public middle school, but I went to a private high school, and the difference in how they handled the situation was kind of immense. So I noticed that at the private school, they had, when you came into the school, they naturally or automatically gave you a certain amount of privileges. So if you had good grades and you were naturally a good student, we had automatic study hall, so you wouldn't have to per se take the study hall. You could skip study hall if you had good grades, or you didn't have to be studying during that time. And then what they would do is hand out disciplinary actions, and the first thing that would come about is academic probation, which means that you have to go to that study hall. You just lose freedoms instead
what
of
did you lose them for? What would be an example of something?
In the classroom, if the biggest thing was skipping class, because you know, we were high around education, and the best way to get educated is by actually showing up to lectures
This
in
was
class.
the private school or the public school?
This was the private school. And so if you missed a lecture, they questioned why. There was also certain meetings you had to be at, like we had a preschool meeting before the day started that, you know, was important for announcements, etc. And they would do kind of attendance there. And if you didn't show up the entire week, you know, you're not part of the community, kind of,
Right.
you would get a warning. And then like after a certain amount of warnings, you talk to the dean of students, and then they'll put you on academic probation.
How was that different from the public school? You said that it was a really
In
different.
public school, if you did one thing wrong in the classroom, they just sent you to in-class detention. And then once that period's over, the kid leaves and just goes to his next class. So on top of like missing the education, nobody really cares about what you're doing. They're just kind of punishing you, and then you're not really knowing why, or like even if you do know why, you're not gaining anything from it. So like the private school had a more attention, like they also kept a really good track record, and they noticed like certain things that would happen, and you know, frequently, and then they would kind of address it with you and your family to like try to work towards a better situation.
So just to be clear, not all public schools are like that, right? So
Yeah, no, not at all.
Yeah, not all districts are like that. I think there's a lot of disparity. Unfortunately, I think the disparity tends to be detrimental to kids who are growing up in high poverty environments.
Absolutely.
And so that's why you get some of these statistics too that are so disparate by race. Yeah.
Just a question, do you think that these local policies in terms of like school decisions made within a community rather than on the state or the federal level, do you think that's affected by whatever issues are plaguing or surrounding the community? Because I know from my experience that the high school that I went to, I won't name it, in South Jersey, the last 2 years there was a very big surge of heroin use, and people were bringing it into the school, and I found that policies
Got more draconian.
were
Yeah.
written and reflected in the sense that the first 2 years they weren't as strict, and then
Right.
the last 2 years they really cracked down, and you know, even the most, to go with the broken windows, the
Right.
most minute offenses became really severe. You know, she said, for example, 3 lates, you get a detention. It became 1 late, you get like an in-school suspension.
Wow.
Yep.
Yes, so to answer your question, I think you answered it really well, yes. And right now, I'm actually really seeing this, I don't know if you guys are connected to high schools through peers and stuff, but the big issue now is vaping, huge, right?
Oh,
Huge,
man.
really big problem. You've got 12, 13-year-olds addicted, seriously addicted. It's really scary, like they can't, you know, they're shaking from not being able to get nicotine. And so schools don't know what to do. And what happens is exactly what you described. When they don't know what to do, the knee-jerk reaction is, let's punish them, right? And part of that is they don't know what to do. They haven't been trained in alternatives. Part of it is like, that's what we've always done. Part of it is, and this is where you see play out in local communities, is it's what the community expects, right? And if you look at the codes in a lot of high schools, I know my daughter's high school, which is not draconian by any means, but if you look at the written code, it says, first offense, this, second offense, this, third offense, it's usually suspension, right? It's like 3 strikes and you're out, kind of like in the criminal system. And so even if they don't harshly apply that, that's kind of the fallback position. And if you don't suspend a child, there's a real pushback. So I live in Princeton, and there was an incident of anti-Semitism in the middle school, and there was so much pressure to expel these kids, like 13, 14-year-old kids, who, you know, obviously needed to have some conversations, but tremendous pressure from the community. And it was like, if you're not punishing them, you're not taking this seriously, right? So that becomes the bar. And I see this now with vaping. It's like, if you don't suspend these kids, the parents don't think it's serious, they won't do anything. But we just know that's not what's happening. We know that's not how it works. Suspending them doesn't help anything. What does help, there are actually alternatives, but you have to know about them, and you have to actually apply them in a concerted way. So one of the alternatives is teaching pro-social behavior. If a child is having issues with self-control, this doesn't work quite so well with vaping or heroin, because that's obviously an addiction situation. But if you have kids who are just coming out of such a turbulent home environment that they just are having issues with emotional control, or that's just, you know, their personalities are prone to that, or they're just immature, you can actually teach them by positive reinforcement. So it's actually a behavioral psych. It's used on animals. When you're training your dog, I know this sounds terrible, but like you're rewarding them for good behavior, and you don't punish them for bad behavior, you ignore bad behavior. So that's what happens with ProActive teaching appropriate behavior. So you tell them how they should behave and you reward good behaviors. And you give them kind of concrete steps, like this is what you should do in this situation. So they're prepared when a situation comes up. It has a very significant impact on decreasing misbehavior in the classroom. This is not like kids wanna act up, often they just don't know how to control themselves, or they don't know what they're expected to do. Another alternative, restorative justice. How many of you have heard of this? Anybody have this at all? It sounds, I thought that maybe you had that in your school from what you were saying, that maybe there was like a restorative justice component, because you said that there's an alternative to suspension. Does anybody have a restorative justice process? You do?
I don't have it in my high school, but I'm an RA here, and we have it in my residence hall because
Yay.
yeah, so like they're doing like a pilot test on my res hall because I'm in Metler Hall on College Ave, and we have a lot of write-ups for like a lot of just different things basically, and they implemented a restorative justice program, and I don't know what the statistics look like because it literally just started like this year, but they said they wanted to try it out with one of like the worst halls first.
Oh,
And
that's
then-
nice. Do the kids know that they're in one of the worst
Yes,
halls?
yes, they do.
Wow, that must make them feel really good about
Yeah,
themselves,
yeah,
right?
it's great to live there and just
Yeah.
be in there, but yeah.
You're the child I don't like,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
That makes you
basically.
love your parents, it makes you
Basically.
wanna do your best, absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow, well, I'm thrilled that Rutgers is trying that, I'm disturbed that we're writing kids up.
Yeah.
Wow,
There's
what do we
literally-
do to them when we write them up?
So what usually happens, it depends on the type of write-up, because there's like different tags for the incident report, the IRs that I write, but it's like, there's policy violations like smoking in the dorm, or like alcohol, cause it's a freshman dorm, so it's like, you can't have alcohol.
No, 18-year-olds don't drink.
Exactly.
Everyone knows that.
Exactly, 100%, obviously.
Absolutely.
And so like it depends on the type of write-up that exists, but it usually just involves a meeting with student conduct and being like, hey, let's forget about what the RA said happened. You tell me what happened. Oh,
That's-
okay.
So that's under the restorative approach.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
and
good. Okay.
student conduct in general is working towards that, just because they're like, you don't really like, as an RA, as like a person, like I'm just a student too, so like I might have like a different view of the situation than what actually happened. So they listen to the resident story, and then they go, okay, let me read you what the RA wrote, and then they will literally just read out my IR verbatim,
Okay.
and then they will have a conversation.
And they is,
Student conduct.
so is that administrators?
Yeah, that's like
It's
a
not under
separate office.
students.
It's a separate office under
Got it.
the umbrella of Redlight, kind of, and then there's like, depending on the punishment, I guess, it's like classes that you go to for alcohol safety, or marijuana, or like fire safety, like that, those kinds of
You're not
things.
kicked out of school?
No,
Which
no.
would be the equivalent of
Yeah.
suspension or expulsion. Thank you, yes, ma'am.
My sister works at like a really high-end private school in New York, like really high-end private school, like 1-to-1 teacher to student ratio private
Wow.
school. But I think that they do a lot of this sort of thing. I guess this is like a really different atmosphere because it's such a high-end private school. But they also take like a lot of what's it called? They take like lower income students too who are like on benefits as
On
well as
scholarship.
part of it. Yeah, on scholarship. But I think that I've heard a bit about stuff like this, like instead of like sending them to like detention and stuff like that, like they take them on walks during class and stuff like that.
In your
So-
sister's school?
Yeah, so like if they can't
Wow,
sit
that
still.
would make you want to kind of act up. I think that sounds pretty nice, especially in a day-to-day, like.
Yeah, like because a lot of students there, like they have a lot of like ADHD and
Okay.
other like
Yeah.
disabilities that might like hamper their learning. They do have things like yoga balls instead of like regular seats so that they don't
Right.
have to sit still. And it like apparently has really shown like a higher performance level in like their students since they've implemented things like that.
And why is sitting still even required? I mean, it's not really shown to improve your learning, right? It's kind of hard, even for you, you're adults, it's hard to sit still. Can you imagine a 7-year-old, let alone a 7-year-old with ADHD? That's a pretty high bar for them to have to sit still. Okay, so yeah, so you guys really nailed it in terms of what is restorative justice. So, in a nutshell, the consequences, so first of all, there's all this pro-social behavioral stuff, but the consequences are to try to restore students to classrooms and school communities rather than suspending them and criminalizing their behavior. So you have to start with an agreed upon code, and the best restorative justice is a code that the students actually develop in conjunction with the school. So it's not passed down to them, but it's something that they help put together with clear expectations, rights, responsibilities, calls for mutual accountability from the adults to support the students, and when students violate the code, there are specific